Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Alistair Edgar. I'm one of the faculty members here at the Balsillie School. This is our current issues Thursday lunchtime speaker, and sponsored in this case by the Multilateral Institutions Research Cluster, which is one that I help to manage here at the school. Our speaker today is Randolph Mank on the topic of Does Canada Need a Foreign Policy Review? As a real, Randolph's bio note is on the Balsillie School website as a research fellow here, but I'll just give you a couple of highlights and then I'll get out of the way because we're here to listen to Randolph. But to let people know, the presentation portion of the talk today is being recorded on the camera behind you. The Q&A part of it won't be, but the presentation part of it will be. So you don't have to worry afterwards that anybody's recording you and will be distributing your questions on YouTube, but the presentation part of it will be up on the Balsillie School's YouTube whenever it's done. Yeah. So Randolph is a global business executive and a three-time former Canadian ambassador. With 30 years of experience in public and private sector. He's currently president of Mank Global, supporting clients with business development, government relations, and representation services, while writing and speaking, like today, frequently on foreign affairs. This one I looked up because I was curious about Asia, the SICPA, but it's secure inks for identification and currencies and labeling and other things. Actually, I looked at the corporate video. It was really cool. I enjoyed it. Before that, he was Senior Advisor and Vice President Asia for BlackBerry. We know them well and are still indebted to their success. In government, Randolph served as Canada's High Commissioner to Malaysia in 2010 to 12. Prior to that, 2008 to 10 as High Commissioner to Pakistan. Prior to that, Director General for Asia at what was then DFATE, Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, 2006 to 8. And in that case, one of his responsibilities was the department's task force for Afghanistan. And prior to that, 2003 to 6, Ambassador to Indonesia, where he led the Canadian response to the 2004 tsunami disaster. He had been Director for Policy Planning in 1999 to 2003, which included heading the G7 Foreign Ministers Secretariat for Canada. Most importantly, of course, he got his BA and his Master's from Wilfrid Laurier University before he decided to go to some other schools that will remain unmentioned. And was Laurier Alumni of the Year 2011, I think. I think I got that right. Laurier Top Alumni, 2011. So Randolph, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us today. So that people know, I'm teaching a class at 1:30, so I will have to sidle out, and some of my students may be sidling out at about 1:25 as well. So you may see some of us heading out. Officially, this event carries on until 2 o'clock. But we will leave a little bit early, and Andrew will be around to close up the event after that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, a special pleasure to be back in my hometown. I always look forward to excuses to come down here. I'm based in Ottawa these days, having come back from Singapore just last year. After a long sojourn in Asia, various guises and places, both in government and the private sector. So it's great to be back on home soil and even closer to home here in Kitchener-Waterloo. It's fabulous for me. I was delighted as well to be invited a couple of years ago to be a fellow of the Balsillie School. And for me, that's a great honor, and I hope that after this talk, you'll allow me to continue rather than immediately canceling it. For me, as a former student at Laurier, you have to forgive me, but it brings back a kind of a rush of nostalgia whenever I come back to Waterloo, because I think of that bachelor's degree I did in English literature and political science, never thinking for one moment that I would wind up in the Canadian Foreign Service. I didn't even know what the Foreign Service was, in fact. Not until I was doing my doctorate at the LSE, that unmentionable school that I've just mentioned, did I encounter discussions of the Foreign Service. I was actually determined to become a teacher and had a teaching offer from UBC while I was doing my doctorate in London. But a buddy of mine wanted to have a ride to the exam center, MacDonald House in Grosvenor Square in London, to write the Foreign Service exam, and he convinced me to give him a ride to the center. I had a car, and to write the test with him. And so I did that and got into the Foreign Service. He didn't get in. He got in the following year and wound up as my boss 30 years later. That's Peter McGovern. Another colleague who studied here with me was my friend from grade 7 over at Cortlandt Avenue Public School, and then Cameron Heights through high school, is a chap named Peter Beam. And we studied the same degrees together, English literature and political science at Laurier, and went off to Great Britain to do our doctorates at the same time. And he joined the Foreign Service the same year I did, again, a fellow who didn't really expect to do that, and wound up as being one of the great stars of foreign affairs, and is now in the Senate of Canada, thanks to his friend Mr. Trudeau, and the great work that he did as the G7 Sherpa. So it does bring back a lot of memories for me. Radio Laurier, I had a Saturday morning show in which I'd torture people with the music that I loved and discussions that I was interested in back then. I had a column in the newspaper and did movie reviews. It was really the best time of life to be a student in Waterloo at that time. I did my master's thesis on terrorism, and little did I know that the theory would become a great reality in my career. First of all, going to London during the IRA bombings and hearing bombings on a regular basis while I was a student in London kind of brought it closer to home than the theories that I was looking at in my master's thesis. And then that kind of followed me as a theme throughout my life and my career. I was a near miss at the Tokyo subway the day that Aum Shinrikyo attacked with the sarin gas. I was just coming out of the subway station at that point. My job was relations with the Japanese parliament, and that was the very subway station that they were attacking. A Buddhist terrorism group, by the way. If anyone tells you that Islam has a monopoly on terrorism, forget it. That is not true at all. I also found that in my postings in Asia that this was a continuing theme as well. This kind of asymmetrical threat, it's sometimes called in academic conversations, of terrorists making tremendous attacks and bringing great destruction upon buildings and people. And the first day I arrived in Indonesia as ambassador, which was my second posting there, the Marriott Hotel was bombed. And we had the Bali bombings, a couple of those, in fact, a couple of incidents. And throughout my posting in Indonesia, we had that kind of calamity. Not to mention the natural disasters. The tsunami of 2004, which I'm sure you all remember, was a huge challenge. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, of course, violence was unfortunately all too common and rather routine from day to day. The Marriott Hotel was bombed there while I was en route to go have sushi with the Japanese sushi chef, and hadn't quite arrived yet, but lost several friends in that bombing. And Afghanistan violence, of course, is well documented. So there is that. I also went off to do my doctoral research on energy policy, and that was another theme that went through my career and continues to this day. Energy policy and federalism in Canada, a topic that couldn't be more current right now as the West is feeling alienated, and that was in the 1970s. I worked with a professor at the business school at Laurier named Gordon MacDougall. And he had landed funding from Energy, Mines and Resources large-scale funding to do a research project surveying 3,000 Canadian households on their energy consumption habits, their knowledge, and their actual home heating bills and petrol bills, so that we could correlate behaviors and knowledge with the things that we could be encouraging them to do. And so we were able to segment the Canadian population and then create energy conservation programs to target the worst offenders in terms of wasteful energy consumption. I was proud of that, and it was a constant, again, throughout my career, working on the energy sector and the environment sector, and the huge dilemma that creates for Canada in trying to manage the contradictions, in a sense, between the two, that aren't always contradictions. It's a very nuanced topic. I looked after the oil and gas sector in many countries, and at the pinnacle of my career, managed to convince Petronas of Malaysia to invest in Canada. And they made, at the time, the single largest investment in the history of Canada as a result, which was valued at $69 billion, only half of which they could announce publicly because they feared it would upset their own public if the Malaysian public found out that so much money was going to Canada for investment. And that is the LNG investment that continues under the Shell umbrella to this day out in British Columbia. So a lot of the things that we did here at Laurier, I'm saying this because I sense there are many students in the audience who are probably wondering where their career will go and whether the things they're studying right now will actually be things they're interested in 30 years later. And my experience is, yeah, absolutely. The things you're studying now could well turn out to be threads that will unite the events of your career and allow you to make the greatest contribution wherever your career leads you. I also wound up, when I arrived in Indonesia the second time as ambassador, reaching for my BlackBerry. This was in 2003. And realizing that even though I was already addicted since the year 2000, I didn't have one in Indonesia. So I flew back a month later and met with Jim Balsillie and said, Jim, let me launch the BlackBerry in Indonesia, if you would. It's the fourth largest country in the world. And he said, that's an interesting idea, but where is Indonesia? And so I explained it to him, and he got rather excited, as he does, and he brought in some senior vice presidents, and we met and chatted. And with his vision and his wisdom and his enormous energy, he agreed that we would launch it. And a month later, I launched it at the Grand Ballroom of the Meridian Hotel in Jakarta. And that country became the single largest revenue driver for BlackBerry in the world. At its peak, even greater than the United States. And that tells you about opportunities that are out there in Asia that, of course, I've been a great proponent of pursuing in my career. So that's just by the way of some nostalgic reflections, but the topic today, of course, is does Canada need a foreign policy review? And I've been writing on this ad nauseum in various publications, and the answer is an obvious yes in my mind. But probably equally obvious is now is not the right timing. And why isn't it the right timing? It's because it's a minority government, and it's a very difficult thing to do during a minority government phase, especially considering that it takes time to do it, and if the government runs out of time, then what happens to the review that's been begun? It dies on the It dies in committee, usually, is what happens, or the consultations with the public are disrupted and it goes off in a different direction. Our current foreign policy, if it has one dominating theme at all, it's our feminist foreign policy. That's the umbrella that has been put over just about all of our programs, and it's an important lens to consider everything we do through. But when you put it up against the geopolitical things that are going on, it's a tough one to sustain. I think it should always be a part of what we do, just like sustainable development is. It should always be embedded in our goals to support the emerging role of women that must continue to emerge and move forward. But here we are now looking at a set of global challenges that are far beyond what we would have predicted. And it starts with the Trump presidency, which has been a bit of a wild card, to say the least, for Canada. The challenging of the entire post-World War II set of international arrangements and institutions, openly critical he is of those arrangements, the challenging of all alliances that the United States has, including the one with Canada, putting on the line the relationship at the price of more favorable trade relations from a U.S. point of view, and renegotiating just about every agreement that was ever agreed to. So that has been a major catalyst for our foreign policy considerations. In the news now is what's going on in the Middle East. That's a perennial thing, and we've seen a horrible episode of how things can escalate and get out of control. We've also seen an example in the last 24 hours of how it can be mediated and brought back under control. There's a lot that's yet to be written on this particular episode and on the Middle East itself. But Canada's been a player as a trainer in Iraq, and therefore we are deeply involved in it, whether we like it or not. Europe is besaddled with the Brexit challenge, and they're going to have to work that out. I was approached by the British government to see if I'd be interested in heading one of the Brexit institutions. I ran probably faster and farther than I'd ever run before in the opposite direction of that. I think they're really going to have some problems ahead, but they'll work it out eventually. Russia and their adventurism is well known. We have a real problem with what they've done in the Ukraine and what they're doing in the Middle East, but that's not going to be stopped by our concerns. That's going to have to be dealt with in a more deft diplomatic way, I'll put it that way. China, the Huawei affair, that's an example of how Iran, Trump, China relations all get jumbled up and entangled and wind up on our doorstep as something to be managed. I've written an op-ed on this affair and suggested that we should stop the chest thumping over China. We heard some of my former diplomatic colleagues calling for us to expel their ambassador from Canada and to redeploy our diplomats from Beijing to other parts of Asia and so on and so forth, and I think that's all wrong. What we need to do is stick with our legal process and adjudicate this as fairly as we can under the circumstances and keep pushing for better treatment of our hostages, I'll call them, in China. Now, Huawei did reach out to me a couple of times, and we've had some discussions about how we might activate that kind of an approach, which is up the middle. And really, I don't know how I could possibly help. I certainly couldn't take any money from a Chinese company, because I think as soon as you do that in Canada these days, you've compromised your impartiality. So Huawei has been an example of the success of public diplomacy. Within my foreign affairs career, and certainly when we were doing our last foreign policy review, which I was quarterbacking at the policy planning level in 2000 to 2003, there was a lot of discussion about how Canada needs to do better on public diplomacy. But I always wondered, well, where does that go, and what purpose does it serve? Is it just we're publicity hounds and we want to be famous in every country around the world? Is it to promote our trade? Is it to promote our human rights agenda? It's all of those things, of course. But if you look on the other side, who has had a more successful public diplomacy program than China, with Huawei investing in universities and think tanks and building corporate partnerships around the world? And that turns out to be something to be somewhat concerned about and guarding against the possible negative consequences of as you go forward. So that's a tricky thing. I've argued also in articles that we're in a kind of a new Cold War situation. It's different from the last Cold War. We're now into a kind of a multi-dimensional chess, as we've seen with Iran and Russia and so on. But really, China and the U.S. Coming at each other is a kind of a Cold War setup. Now, I began my career, my first assignment was in Athens, but then quickly I was shifted over to Stockholm, where I was a delegate to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And this was post-Helsinki, the Helsinki conference that led to breakthroughs on observance of human rights in Soviet Union. And it all turned around mutual assured destruction on the nuclear file. And you know, that's an organizing principle of great importance in international relations on nuclear matters, and that to the extent that that continues to keep us from nuclear warfare today, it's extremely valuable. It also has great weaknesses, and you see some of the international treaties that were components of MAD, mutual assured destruction, starting to be weakened now. Also, you see layered on top of the nuclear threat a whole array of other technological threats that are potentially coming at us. We talk a lot about cyber threats and AI, but robotics, nanotech, all sorts of technologies are emerging that can, I won't say easily, but readily weaponized and need to be controlled around some principle that will carry us forward and maintain global peace into the future. We don't have that principle. We don't have a mutual assured destruction for all of that. We've got it for nuclear, but we're lacking the second part. I'm currently working on a research paper to propose exactly what that international organizing principle should be, and then the international organizations that you need to govern that international principle of deterrence. And I think that's extremely important. I think that should be in the review when we finally get to it. As I say, I don't think the time is right now for a review because of the minority government. I think what we could do now, and I've written an article on this as well, which is about to be published, I think, this week, we should review the instruments of our foreign policy. The MacDougal Commission was a royal commission that made its report when I joined the Foreign Service in 1980, which was an examination of the conditions of foreign service and foreign affairs itself, as it was called at the time. I think we need something similar to that now. Because it's a minority government, I would suggest that it be done by the Senate. The Senate has Peter Harder and Peter Beam in it, who are two of the top diplomats that we've had in modern history, who could easily, not easily, but certainly readily be charged with leading such an investigation of not just Global Affairs Canada, but defense and immigration and development and so on and so forth. And look to see what's going on. I know from all of my friends at Global Affairs Canada that there are literally hundreds of positions that are lying vacant in that department, and hundreds more that are improperly staffed with term positions. And we've got feeder groups like this here who could, with the proper management of the human resources function, be used to absorb bright young people to bring them into the global affairs foreign service, and also to fan out to other departments to start building the capacities that we're going to need for the now and the years to come. And people with a more modern technological perspective, I think, will be key to the future of Canada's diplomacy. I've written a paper called Quantum Diplomacy, proposing that we need a whole new perspective on the way we run our diplomacy. Not quantum because it's particles moving around, but we're in the quantum age. And the quantum age is an age where technology is developing at an exponential pace in ways that need to be both harnessed for the good and defended against for the bad. And that leads to what I was mentioning earlier about what I think our future diplomacy should look like. I think we need rules for deterrence around asymmetrical threats, as well as the conventional state-to-state threats in the cyber and other technological domains. And I think that if we don't pursue that, we're going to be lost in our foreign policy, wandering around in the wilderness for years to come, allowing other actors to jerk us in one direction or another without a great sense of purpose or forward objectives and goals. And I'd rather see us have a purpose that was very clear and meaningful and purposeful. I'd like to see our multilateralism not to be rhetorical, but to be meaningful. When we were working on the Stockholm Conference, we were actually working on confidence-building measures, things that were very meaningful in guarding world peace, to make sure that there wasn't accidental nuclear war or that NATO troop movements wouldn't be misinterpreted by the Soviets and lead to some sort of an escalation of combat in the European theater. I wanted to finish by laying down a challenge to the Balsillie School and the partners here, CG and the Center for Quantum Computing. I was at a conference on cybersecurity that the Monk School organized down in Ottawa, a very private meeting with select invitees and Chatham House rule. So I can't tell you very much about what was discussed, but I can tell you there is a process of discussion that is extremely important, that I actually think would be even better served by the group of organizations that are here in Waterloo that could, in my own perspective, could be a leading group working together on this quantum diplomacy that I've been talking about. Coming up with rules of the road, principles of deterrence, models for international organizations, and other meaningful things like that, that really are better fed by people who are working on the sorts of things that the institutions down here in Waterloo are very good at and are houses to great expertise. So I'd like to lay down that challenge to all of you, and certainly the professors and administrators here in Waterloo, to take that up, to create your own group on quantum diplomacy in your own institution if it leads to that. I've been working very hard with the policy group, who are some of my former staff at Global Affairs Canada, to push this idea and to push specifically that it be housed down here in Waterloo, my old hometown, looking for an excuse for me to move back and pitch in. So I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session where we can speak off camera and talk about all sorts of salacious things. Thanks very much for your patience.